not a destination, but a journey on which we are embarked. And every day as we live, as we respond to the challenges that come up, we may have reason to again go back legislatively and otherwise to bring reforms that bring the comfort that we want as a people to have in our democratic life, in our systems of good governance, and to ensure by and large that the fundamental assumption of our Westminster model and our system, and even that too, can be the subject of reform. And indeed, in other countries, not every country within the CARICOM region operates under the Westminster model. Guyana, for example, has their own permutation of that particular model. And so there are several avenues in which we may engage. In recent times, the government of Trinidad and Tobago sought to bring certain legislative reforms, introduce term limits, which we in St. Kitts and Nevis are also committed to. Because we have come to see that when governments are in power for too long, when one man or one woman is at the helm for too long, tendencies towards dictatorship almost always begin to step in. And that is not the quality of life and the way of life that we prefer as citizens of the CARICOM community. I want to rest base on those remarks and observation, and to thank the chairman again for allowing me to insert these particular reflections. Thank you.
I'm indeed grateful to you, Honorable Prime Minister, for those very important principles of good governance, and certainly your experience in the electoral reform process, past and present in your own St. Kitts and Nevis, is of great value to the rest of the Caribbean. I thank you for those comments, Prime Minister. Now, I invite Mrs. Sylvia Kuffler, Minister Counsel, Political, Trade, Press and Information section within the EU delegation to Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. Mrs. Kuffler.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, for inviting me to this panel here. It has been a very fascinating morning and afternoon. And because this is the first time that I'm able to address you, please allow me to clarify first something, to dispel some myths that have come up during the discussions today. Before, I promise I will make very short remarks on the topic of governance and electoral reform in the interest of time. You have heard this morning several times a reference to the EU blacklist of tax havens, and I would like to make a few comments on that, because I think that there has been a misunderstanding about what the European Union and the European Commission in particular wanted to achieve with that. And it has led to some alarmist statements, which I think are a little bit exaggerated. So the key fact is that there is no new assessment by the European Union. There is no new list, there's no new assessment. And let me explain. The Commission, the European Commission, has simply proposed a new action plan to make corporate taxation fairer and more transparent within the European Union. Now, in this context, it also addressed the concerns of some member states that complained that the profits of actions of business within the European Union was not taxed within the European Union. And therefore, the European Commission looked also at the international aspects of this new taxation plan. And that's why the action plan addressed these uncooperative jurisdictions in third countries. I repeat, it is not a new assessment. It's simply a compilation of existing lists of member states as they were at the end of 2014. If 10 member states had a country in the Caribbean as an uncooperative jurisdiction on their national list, it would have been placed on this common list. So there cannot be new consequences because, I repeat, there is no new assessment. There should not be an impact in investment or credit ratings, because if somebody would consider this, he would not have understood the exercise. If you look indeed at the list of the member states, you see, for example, that the United Kingdom or Germany are not there. And other countries that are there, they have very limited commercial exchanges and trade with the countries in the Caribbean. So you can see that the limit of this list. So the aim of the Commission was a very different one, as I said. It was to generally harmonize the corporate taxation systems in the European Union. Because you have to consider that the criteria are very different from one member state to another. And that is very frustrating for the operation of our single market that we have within the European Union. In general, these criteria are compliance with transparency and exchange of information, absence of harmful tax measures, and others. So it's not always poor blacklisting, but it can also be just low taxation rates. So the EU Commission was aiming at making member states' criteria more transparent, to coordinate and harmonize the criteria, and to encourage the member states to regularly update their criteria in line with a common EU standing. Now, this approach may seem arbitrary outside the EU, but in the long term, it has also its advantages to third countries, because you will have a much clearer picture on what is considered a tax haven by the European Union and not by each single country. Ideally, think about that. You would have, and you are partially now, negotiating with 28 member states of the European Union bilateral taxation treaties. But in the future, you might have just need one. Meanwhile, it is indeed in the interest of Caribbean countries to contact bilateral member states who are on the list to find out about the standards, and the list is regularly updated. One last word about the OECD and its global forum. The EU and its member states are very much part of the OECD, and we contribute actively to its workings. However, there is one difference. Whilst the OECD considers only transparency and exchange of information as criteria, some European Union member states also have harmful tax measures, such as extremely low taxation rates, as a criteria. As I said, every member state applies currently different criteria, and we would simply like to harmonize them. So the legislation in the European Union goes much further than the OECD. And it could be that a country that is considered compliant or largely compliant by the OECD would not be considered the same by all 28 member states. So please let me just conclude and clarify one more time, there is no new assessment by the European Union. So I thank you for having me given the opportunity to say this. I didn't want to say this in the morning because I didn't want to intervene in this very fertile Caribbean discussion. As you can see, I'm probably the only foreigner here. So I could not make the statement earlier. But as I promised, I will be very short about the topic good governance and electoral reform, because in the interest of time. But the European Union has no major criticisms about the democratic systems in this area. I mean, you come from Westminster democracy tradition. We have our own challenges in the European Union. Democracy is not something we take for granted. We have currently some member states that are thinking about introducing some, some penalties that are not in line with our human rights concepts. So it's a constant fight to keep this alive. And I would like to just say, as Prime Minister Harris said, it's a journey, you know, there is no perfect democracy. You started, there is always another step, something that can make you more perfect. And so I'd just like to have a few questions rather than making any statements. And that will be, as I'm still very new to this region, I see also that there is this system of first past the post, you know, and there is no element of representational participation in parliament. And I was wondering, thinking about certain countries here where you have no member of the opposition in the parliament, whether that is really a very healthy democratic system or whether it wouldn't be better to have also the opposition represented in the parliament, and so to change the electoral system, that could be guaranteed. In Europe, we have in some places a fully representational system that leads to many parties, many political parties, so perhaps it's not always the ideal situation. But I think here in the Caribbean, you also have this development that you have, like in St. Kitts, where you have now several political parties, or in Guyana, where you also had several political parties, so you don't always have now this opposition and leading party. So it's perhaps something that could also be looked at in the Caribbean, an introduction of a representational element in the electoral system. The other question was already also highlighted by Prime Minister Harris, is about the fact if you have somebody who is re-elected and again re-elected as Prime Minister and perhaps a third time re-elected. He was already saying it's in our human nature that the longer we are on the helm of a government, the more we feel that we don't make any mistakes and that we have so much experience that we know everything. So that's also something that perhaps could be introduced in the electoral systems of the countries. And the third question, the last question I wanted to ask is about the diaspora and the diaspora having the voting rights, coming back and voting. So that's also an area that is sort of, for me, is new, and I'm looking at that. I'm myself a diaspora because when I go back to Italy, I can vote when I go back, but I cannot vote outside. So it's a question also that I think has to be a little bit better addressed. In Europe, we have gone as far as actually accepting that foreign residents can vote in municipal elections even if you are not a citizen of that country. For example, when I am resident in Belgium and I'm not a citizen of Belgium, I can participate in municipal local elections. So that's, I think it's a very good way, because in the small community, you really participate, you can really participate in the political life. So it's an idea also to give to those people a possibility. Those were a few questions that I had on my mind, and I would be happy if you think further about this and it leads to something. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Koffler, for your contribution. Prime Minister, do you want to come back on any issue?
Well, the only issue, and without continuing debate, I believe that the mention from the EU rep is interesting, but it also shows that we have a problem perhaps of international governance, because really who sets the agenda in terms of transparency and compliance by jurisdictions in relation to tax matter? Is it a function of the Global Forum? And how are we going to reconcile that there is a body authorized to address this matter? And yes, in 2014, member states went before, laid their case, got their designation, largely compliant, and then come sometime thereafter other groups, other jurisdictions, some of them even more dirty than any about which they complain, in terms of their lack of transparency in their own tax management issues, could then issue a list contrary to the designations that others had had from the Jew body. Clearly there is a problem there. And to think now that we are also hearing that that particular membership, some of them with little interaction with the countries which they criticize, never once made a query to that particular country, could of their own volition make a determination that casts aspersions on the integrity of the systems of member states. That is problematic, and that ought to be condemned at all times. And we are grateful that the OECD did in fact respond to say and to distance itself from the work of the EC Commission. We can't have a situation where the OECD, with the legitimate authority, saying one thing, and then the EC Commission goes on its own wild goose chase and tarnish other jurisdiction. That is going to be problematic, and I think all of us must resist it. I have a particular problem with one country saying, because this comes from the presentation, that it's not just no longer now a question of transparency, it is not just a question of cooperation and tax matters, but it is whether or not your tax policy is harmful, whether or not your tax is too low. That is a significant intrusion in what has always been considered a sovereign right, which people fought for, shed blood for. No taxation without representation. And it is reprehensible that any government anywhere and any group of bureaucrats at the EU or elsewhere should determine for a member country what their tax policy ought to be. That mandate must come from the people in those jurisdictions. So they can't determine that for us. And we shall object to that strongly, vehemently, and as consistently as the situation demands. That policy needs to be revisited because it is not helpful and it doesn't lead to goodwill about countries which have long had strong relationship with the member states of the EU. So I condemn that particular approach, and I believe that all right-thinking people would see that as attempting to have extraterritorial application of one fiscal policy. It can't work and it will not work.
I thank you, Prime Minister. Ms. Koffler.
Thank you. I appreciate very much your comments. Let me just reiterate that the objective of this new action plan was to introduce a common corporate tax base within the European Union. And there is a situation where member states have very different criteria, and we are not discussing here, the European Commission was not discussing whether they are correct or they are not correct, but just stating the fact that there are very different criteria, and it would be useful to harmonize it in the interest of the single market that we have in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, Mrs. Koffler, for the contributions on this particular subject matter. Most interesting and a very serious subject matter. May I now invite the general public to weigh in? Yes, Ambassador Frankai.
Good afternoon to the Assembly. I am Ras Frankai, representative, of course, of a very much maligned minority in this Caribbean, a minority which nevertheless has spread its wings on an international basis. I just want to make a few comments on some of the deliberations so far today. And I think that one of the more interesting assertions that has been made has come from Professor Persaud and his conceptualization of an anti-growth coalition, of his representation and conceptualization of our lack of vision, as he has even said, of our declining ambitions as a people who have come from such a troubled past and such a troubled history and have been able to endure through this troubled history. I think Mrs. Coke-Hamilton alluded to it in the trade aspects also, in terms of the inability to think outside of the box of Caribbean peoples, our leaders, and to some extent even our people as a whole. The lack of vision, the lack of an imagination. Our poet laureate from St. Lucia, Derek Walcott, says that the only nation to which he gives a credence and a loyalty is his imagination. And I think that we have to become, as Caribbean people, a little more into this visionary aspect that the poet is perhaps asking us to go towards. And I think which Professor Persad also indicated. So that, as Mrs. Coke-Hamilton was suggesting, when our private sector is contributing only less than 1% to research and development, it shows that they're just being tied in to a vortex of underdevelopment, as has been pointed out by some of our thinkers and our economists, etc. Dr. Walter Rodney, for example, the vortex of underdevelopment. When we heard from Mr. Dukaran too, he talked about Trinidad and Tobago going into associations with outside entities, but not neglecting CARICOM. And I am concerned as to how our relationships, something which perhaps PM Harris just alluded to, with these outside entities is going to be coordinated and integrated, so that when we think of the FTA and the Free Trade Area of the Americas, or of more recently of the European, the EPA, how are we going to approach this on an integrated, combined essence, while thinking outside of the box and trying to get out of the vortex of underdevelopment which our relationships with the metropolitan countries have kept us into. Let me just relate this now very briefly to the whole question of good governance and electoral reform. I recall, was it about 20 years ago, that a distinguished panel of Caribbean thinkers had instituted a constitutional reform consultation throughout the Caribbean. What the report from this came up with, we are yet to know, and this was perhaps just mothballed or just put on the shelf and given very little thought of. I am concerned then with not only electoral reform, but as PM Harris alluded to, the need for some constitutional reform. Because I am saying that if we have to be so careful about how we pick our individuals on these electoral commissions, wouldn't it be better for us to devise a system which gets away from the partisan way in which these things are set up, so that regardless of who we put on them, they are so constituted as to ensure integrity and impartiality. To our distinguished European Union delegate, in this whole question of associations by the Caribbean with outside entities like the European Union and others, like our big brother America, for example, too, I think we have to be very careful in just bandying around the word democracy. And I'm saying this again in terms of the need for constitutional, as higher and above just electoral reform, to eliminate some of the anomalies that have been cited in the electoral system. But one of the things now which the Caribbean is actively trying to engage with the rest of the world, and particularly our former oppressors, our former colonial masters, is the whole question of reparations. Reparations for the wrongs of slavery and consequent colonialism. And I'm wondering how our EU representative thinks and how is the thinking of the EU towards this whole question, this very vexing question of reparations for former oppressions, and how this will dictate then our Caribbean leaders in thinking of associations with the outside world. Thank you very much.
Ambassador. Those were extremely good observations, and of course, we always like your contribution. Ms. Koffler, you wanted to come back and respond to the ambassador's intervention, his question and observation.
Thank you. Your question about the reparations for slavery. As the European Union as such, you know, we are not party to this discussion. It's the member states, and we are very mindful of the sovereignty of the member states. So you would have to address this question to the former colonial powers that are member states of the European Union. As at the level of the European Union, what we do is we provide, you know, a lot of development cooperation assistance to this region. And I mean, one example is Carib Export that receives big funds from the European Union. And I can just say we have just signed a regional indicative program for the whole of the Caribbean to the tune of 346 million euro. They will be used up to 2020, so for 5 years, 6 years. And the three focuses will be actually energy, climate change, climate resilience. The second area is crime and security, and the third one is regional integration. In general, the European Union is the biggest grant provider in this region, with approximately, as we always say, 1 billion euros up to 2020. So it's in terms of development assistance that we operate.
Thank you ever so much, Mrs. Koffler, and I thank the Honorable Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis for his most invaluable contribution, most valuable contribution. Ladies and gentlemen, this has brought us to the end of this session, that is session 4. I did promise before we move into the final session that we have the last Digicel Smart Set, and we will invite the 3 remaining students to respond to a question that I will pose, and the Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis will adjudicate this particular matter. What electoral challenges PM Harris spoke of a few minutes ago that are most pivotal to good governance? That is the question. It is for the 3 of you. It is the question once again, what electoral challenges PM Harris spoke of a few minutes ago during his presentation are most pivotal to good governance?
Good afternoon, my name is Liana Simon, coming from the Antigua State College. From what I could remember, one of the most important ones he talked about was democracy. He also said that persons should be freely able to cast their votes to be an electorate. He also talked about transparency in government and easy access to information. That's what I can remember, sorry.
Thank you. Let us have the, yes?
Good day. My name is Ashante O'Keefe, and I am also from the Antigua State College. From the remarks that were given by Dr. Harris, there were several points which I had recorded, that we should consider the fact that we have struggled for rights to, vote, rights to achieve our ability to have adult suffrage, where the majority of individuals are able to have some sort of significant input in the selection of individuals who represent them in the parliaments. There were ideas of methods to prevent the obstruction of democracy, where he considered situations where individuals who came into power used their power that they were given to obstruct the ability of other individuals to use their rights to actually prevent those individuals in power from, exploiting their power. He made several examples in relation to persons trying to extend their, their stay in office using various methods where they would prevent parliamentary decisions from going forward, for example. Access to information and transparency was also discussed, where it was considered that in the technological age that we live in, the internet and access to various tangible forms of information is always significant. And I believe that from that you could even imply that we are an educated people now, and that we have to face, the governments have to face uneducated people and not the people who are ignorant and unable to, as he had mentioned, view the outside world and see the way that they operate in their governmental systems. So, I mean, from all the points that were gathered, I believe that the main idea was ensuring that transparency and accountability are not just words that are floated around at elections, but more realistically and also technologically realized in our various governmental systems.
Thank you very much. I note the male student has decided not to participate. You're not entering. Okay. Thank you. Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. I'm in the difficult position of a voter being forced to choose. We had two very good students, and I want to commend them all for having come, being unaware of the question, and being able to well represent themselves. I want to, having congratulate them, to say I am partial to the presentation that came from the second presenter and recommend her for consideration, sir.
May I invite her up so that, Prime Minister, you can award her her gift. Compliments Digicel. Thank you ever so much. And once again, I say thanks to Digicel for being a very supportive partner in this enterprise. We also wish to say thanks to the Department of Marine Services, the Hadid Motors, the Antigua Port Authority, and Caribbean Times. All have contributed, all towards this forum being a success. We thank all. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are close to home, to the destination. We are at session 5, which is our final session. It is entitled The Caribbean Today and Beyond. Now, on your draft program, there is